Hey everyone, tonight we're going to tell a story that starts with something so ordinary it might slip right past you. A small corner store at the crossroads of town, sunlight barely filtering through a scratched window, and a woman wiping the counter as she's done for the past 7 years. No miracle, no great premonition, just a soft knock on the glass, and a look that if you weren't paying attention, you'd think was just another mischievous kid who lost their way. If you believe letting a stranger sleep in your store for one night couldn't possibly change your life, then you might want to buckle up. So before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what we share here. And don't forget to comment below where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now turn off the lights, let a gentle fan hum in the background, and drift with us into tonight's journey. That day there was no snow, but the air was cold, the kind of cold that felt like someone had just exhaled through a crack in the door. Ruth Callahan, a single mother in her early 40s, was restocking the edge of the candy shelf when she heard the chime of the doorbell. She looked up. A boy stood there, gray hoodie soaked through, hands deep in his pockets, his muddy shoes looking like they'd walked halfway across the state. He didn't say a word, just stared inside like he was trying to calculate whether he could step in without getting yelled at. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter. Her gaze was calm as always. "Cold out, huh?" she asked gently. The boy nodded barely. "Come in. If you stay out there much longer, your nose is gonna freeze right off." It sounded like something she'd said to 100 neighborhood kids before, but this time it was the start of a storm. In the small kitchen behind the shop, a pot of mushroom soup was still sitting cold. Ruth poured a bowl, set it on the table, and handed the boy a dry towel. "My name's Ruth. What's yours?" "Mason." "Where you from, Mason?" "I got lost." She didn't press further, not because she wasn't curious, but because once she'd hated being asked when she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she poured hot water into a mug, spread butter on a slice of bread, and gently placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "Eat up. You're safe here." Outside, the town of Coldridge moved through its usual Wednesday morning like always. What Ruth didn't know was that across the street, a housewife had seen Mason walk into the shop. And in a town this small, sometimes what people see matters less than how they choose to tell it. That night, Mason slept on a fold-out cot behind the shop, covered by a thin blanket. Ruth had cleared a corner of the storage room, stacked some cardboard boxes to make a makeshift nightstand, and placed a small lamp and a wrapped cookie on top. She didn't ask where he came from. She didn't ask who his parents were. She just said softly, "If you need anything, knock 3 times on the door. I won't lock it." In the middle of the night, Ruth woke up to a sound not knocking. It was a muffled sob, like someone choking back tears through clenched teeth. She stepped outside. Mason was curled under the blanket, his whole body trembling, caught in the grip of a nightmare that hadn't faded yet. He didn't realize she was there until the lamplight skimmed across his face. That's when Ruth saw the bruises, faint purple marks around his wrists shaped like adult fingers. She didn't ask. She didn't say "poor thing" or "my God." She just pulled the blanket up a little higher and whispered, "You're okay now. No one's going to hurt you here." The next morning the sun came out, pale but warm. Ruth made 2 cups of hot cocoa. Mason sat at the small kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the mug but not drinking. "Where did you used to live?" "With Uncle Larry. But he's gone now." "Who's your uncle?" "He used to be in the army, but now they won't let me stay with him." Something tightened in Ruth's chest, the feeling you get when reading a story with the last page torn out. Before she could say more, Mason looked down at the floor and mumbled, "Ms. Ruth, I didn't steal anything." That sentence stopped her in her tracks, not because she suspected him, but because she realized something. A child only says that when they've been treated like a criminal before anyone ever asks them who they are. Outside, everything still looked peaceful, or pretended to be. But Ruth started noticing glances, strangers peering through her front window, people pausing outside her shop, whispering before walking off. One regular came in, saw Mason in the back kitchen and muttered, "Just loud enough, didn't know this place still served normal folks." Ruth smiled as if she hadn't heard it, but the way her hand tightened around her coffee cup, just barely enough to send a ripple across the foam, said otherwise. That evening, Mason handed her a small piece of folded paper. It was a hand-drawn map, a scribbled route to a bus stop near the edge of the woods. "I'll leave tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "Don't worry, I won't be any more trouble." Ruth looked at him. "You think I gave you shelter for one night just to kick you out? Most people do." She exhaled. It wasn't a sigh, it was a promise. "You're staying until we find someone you can trust. And if that takes forever, then you can stay here forever, too." That morning, Ruth opened the shop earlier than usual. Not because there was a new shipment or a line of customers waiting, but because she hadn't slept much the night before. And she knew this town, once it sniffed out something unusual, it wouldn't rest until it had chewed on it from every angle. She wasn't one for speculation, but when Mrs. Glenda, who'd bought hand lotion and weekly tabloids here since 2012, walked right past the shop without even glancing inside, Ruth knew something had started. Mason was sitting in the back, silently cutting pieces of cereal boxes into tiny scraps. He called them leaves for his pretend forest camp. Ruth didn't pry. She remembered how her daughter Chloe used to do the same, back when she was too young to grasp truth, but just sensitive enough to stay busy, because waiting for a father who wouldn't return was a game she already knew how to lose. Around noon, old Postman Louis, the town's longest-serving mailman, showed up with a handwritten letter, no return address. The note said only one thing, scrawled in jagged ink. "We saw you let the stray kid in. If he hurts anyone, it's on you." "Coldridge doesn't need people like that." Ruth read it, then looked up at Louis. The old man cleared his throat, awkwardly, eyes darting. Maybe someone's jealous of your candy sales," he said, then gave a crooked smile, the kind of smile people wear when they know more than they're willing to admit. Within 48 hours, it was as if the whole town had caught a cold, a fever of whispered rumors and silent accusations. No angry phone calls, just absence. Customers stopped coming. The coffee Ruth brewed still smelled warm and nutty. The pastries were golden and perfect, but no one asked for them. A young mother walked her toddler past the shop, glanced through the window, then instinctively pulled her child closer to her side, as if Ruth could transmit something dangerous from the boy crouching behind the counter. That afternoon, Chloe came home from school wearing a strange expression. "Mom," she said, "today the teacher asked me, 'Is that boy still staying with your family?'" "What did you say?" Chloe shrugged, eyes shining with mischief. "I said, 'Yeah, and he snores like my dad used to.'" Ruth burst out laughing, a real laugh, unforced. Her daughter had just pierced through prejudice with a single memory, one that carried warmth, not fear. But laughter couldn't erase what she saw the next morning. Red spray paint across the shop's front, harboring bad kids' boycott. This store. Ruth wiped it off with a wet cloth soap and lemon water, an old remedy passed from neighbor to neighbor. Not because it was effective, but because it made you feel like you'd done something. She paused, looked through the window at Mason inside, drawing on a milk carton with a dull pencil. He'd sketched a house with a chimney, a cat, and underneath it, in clumsy block letters, "A store where no one gets kicked out." Ruth smiled even as her throat tightened. There's a unique way to measure whether a small-town store still has its community's support. It's the sound of the bell above the door. At Ruth's shop, that bell used to chime like a kitchen clock, steady, warm, unnoticed until it went silent. For 3 days in a row, the bell didn't ring. Not because Ruth had closed the store, not due to a snowstorm or power outage like in years past, but because the cars once familiar with pulling up onto the brick sidewalk, stopping by the window to grab a pastry or a bag of ground coffee now rolled past, as if Ruth had never existed. One afternoon she was counting up unsold inventory and realized the whole grain bread had expired 3 days ago. That had never happened before, not in Ruth's shop. This was the place where townsfolk used to scramble for the last warm slice, treating it like gold wrapped in brown paper. That same day, the delivery guy from Miller's Bakery called to apologize. "Miss Ruth, we've gotten some feedback. Can't say more, but for now, we have to stop supplying Coldridge General. Hope you understand." Ruth didn't ask who the feedback came from. She just thanked him and hung up. Some questions, if asked, only leave people flustered. They rarely give you the answer you need. That night, Mason helped sort expired goods. He counted cans of beans, organized gum by color, and asked with innocent logic, "If nobody's buying, why do you keep the store open?" Ruth looked up. "Because if I close, they'll be right." Mason frowned. "Right about what? That kindness is only worth it when it doesn't cause trouble." He fell silent, but this time it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of thinking. That night, something small happened. Chloe, the daughter Ruth had raised through countless sleepless nights, took a marker and wrote on the chalkboard sign in front of the store, "Today's special 1 free cup of cocoa for anyone feeling sad." And underneath, in her careful handwriting, "We don't sell peace. But if you need it, feel free to stay a while." The next morning, Ruth saw the sign still there untouched, but tucked under the front door was a small piece of paper. "They don't hate you, they're scared. And scared people usually choose the window. No name, no signature, just a note." But Ruth knew from years of running a counter, the anonymous ones were often the most honest. In small towns like Coldridge, there's a kind of letter that doesn't need a stamp or a sender's name, yet it shows up right on time like the rising sun. They're called hate notes, and Ruth started getting them. Not emails, not anonymous texts like in the big cities. These came folded by hand, slipped directly into the mailbox outside the shop. Written in pen, blue ink, sometimes smudged. Letters slanted like someone who once took calligraphy in middle school. The first one simply said, "Bad kids belong in juvie, not at the general store." The second was more deliberate. "Decent people don't drag trash into town." Ruth read them, folded them back, didn't throw them away. She placed each one inside an old cookie tin, snapped the lid shut. Not to save them as evidence, but to remind herself, sometimes you need to wrap ugliness in tin so you don't end up hurling it back at the world. One morning, Chloe asked Mom, "If someone doesn't like you, does that mean you should change?" Ruth was tying her daughter's hair. She answered softly, "You only change if it helps you grow. But if you have to pretend to be worse just to be accepted, then don't." Chloe nodded like she'd just solved a math problem about courage. Mason seemed to sense the quiet tension creeping through the store. He began folding paper airplanes from cereal box cardboard. On each one he scribbled a short line, "I'm not bad. I'm running from something awful. I had an uncle named Larry." Ruth gathered the planes and placed them in a box. "Who are you writing those for?" "I don't know," Mason said, "but if they fly far enough, maybe someone will see." The answer was simple, but it held Ruth in silence for a long while. Then one day she found a new note, this one not folded. It was taped right to the glass door. "If you don't get rid of that kid, we will." No name, no signature, but for the first time, it used the word "you." No longer vague, no longer passive. Now it was pointed. She peeled it off, took it to the back, and burned it inside the old cookie tin. Mason stood by watching. "You scared?" he asked. Ruth shook her head. "No, I'm angry. Angry at what that people would rather threaten a child than look in the mirror." That night, Ruth poured herself a cup of cocoa for the first time in weeks. She sat at the counter, one hand holding the mug, the other resting on the old mailbox now brought inside. The yellow glow of the shop's overhead light reflected off the glass door, making the store look bigger, or maybe just holding its breath. Monday morning arrived gray as a misprinted page. No rain, no sunshine, just a heavy stillness, as if even the sky couldn't decide whom to side with. Ruth was taking inventory when a knock echoed through the store, not the usual chime of her front doorbell, but 3 firm, deliberate knocks, the kind drilled into muscle memory at boot camps. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out front. 2 uniformed officers stood behind the glass. One was tall, his shirt tight across the shoulders from the weight of his belt radio baton, the usual tools of authority. The other was leaner, wearing dark sunglasses on a morning with no sunlight. Ms. Callahan. Yes, that's me. We've received a few calls reporting a minor living illegally at a place of business. Ruth didn't flinch. She simply looked them in the eye. The boy is having breakfast in the back. If you'd like, I can ask him to come out. The older officer frowned. You're confirming he's been staying here overnight? I am. I'll also confirm he hasn't stolen anything, broken anything, and just so we're thorough, he brushes his teeth twice a day. A pause. The younger officer gave the faintest smile, the kind that's not in any official manual. You know that housing an underage child without legal guardianship can fall under potentially endangering behavior. Ruth nodded. So if I offered temporary shelter to an injured adult who lacked an insurance card, would that make me prosecutable too? The officer narrowed his eyes. You're comparing a runaway child to an injured victim. Ruth stepped behind the counter and lifted a wooden panel, revealing Mason's backpack, torn on one side, stained with dried blood. He's not a runaway. He escaped. That one sentence split the air like a sharp whistle. And maybe, just maybe, it disrupted the script inside the officers' heads. Silence lingered long enough for the old desktop fan to hum in the corner. Finally, the older officer spoke slowly. We'll report this to Child Protective Services, but for now, there's no basis for intervention. He hesitated, then added, but be careful. People around here get complicated when they don't understand something. Ruth nodded with the calm of someone who's already been complicated by others. Yeah, I see it every time someone buys tuna but forgets a spoon. As the officers turned to leave, Mason stepped out from behind the shelf. I heard, he whispered, you don't have to protect me like that. Ruth looked at him, her hand resting on the wooden counter. I'm not protecting. I'm standing beside you. Big difference. That night, the store was still quiet, but Ruth turned the radio on, choosing an old jazz tune from a dusty, knob-cracked player. Chloe pulled out coloring paper. Mason kept writing his paper airplane messages. Just another ordinary evening. No knocks, no threats, and sometimes that's all you really need. That morning, the sky was unusually clear. Sunlight slanted through the shop windows, spreading across the floor as if someone had quietly swept the air clean after a storm without a name. Ruth was washing a batch of old clothes in a plastic basin behind the store, most of them Mason's. His gray hoodie was fraying with a tear in the front pocket. She planned to patch it with fabric from an old pair of jeans, but as her fingers slipped inside the torn lining, they touched something hard. It was a small metal badge, hexagonal, black-trimmed, with words etched on the front, Fort Landon Base, Honor Unit 27. On the back, 2 tiny letters written in metal pen, LG. Ruth sat still for a few seconds, not because she immediately knew what it was, but because something about that inscription tapped gently at her memory, like a melody she once knew and had just started humming again. When she handed the badge to Mason, the boy froze for a moment. Then he gingerly took it with both fingers like it might break. It was my uncle's, he whispered. Uncle Larry Granger. He used to be a soldier. He was stationed at Fort Landon. Ruth tilted her head. He adopted you. Mason nodded. He took me in when my mom couldn't anymore. He taught me how to read maps, write letters, even how to spell friendship. But then he got sick, and they wouldn't let me stay with him anymore. They, who people with power who don't need reasons. Ruth stayed quiet, but in her mind the puzzle pieces were falling into place. Fort Landon, she'd heard of it, an old military base northwest of here, partly converted into a training center. Granger, that name, rang a bell. She remembered seeing it in a feature once Silent Heroes column in the Coldridge Weekly years ago. That afternoon, after Mason went down for his nap, Ruth turned on the dusty old computer behind the counter. The internet connection was as moody as Mrs. Glenda when her order of oat milk got mixed up. She typed Lawrence Granger, Fort Landon. The search didn't return many results, but enough to make her sit up straight. Major General Lawrence Granger, former commander of Brigade 27, awarded for rescuing a stranded unit in the Iraqi desert in 2007. The article included a photo, silver hair, sharp eyes, and a smile that looked exactly like Mason's when he was caught off guard. She scrolled down. Granger now lives in quiet retirement at a small home on the edge of Fort Landon after early retirement due to medical reasons. She closed the laptop and thought, so the boy this whole town is afraid of is family to one of the men who once helped protect this country. When Mason woke up, she handed him a printed map. Would you like to visit your uncle tomorrow? Mason looked up, eyes bright like it was the first snowfall of the year. I thought, nobody wanted to take me there. Well, Ruth smiled, lucky for you, I'm not nobody. The next morning, Ruth woke up even before Chloe's alarm clock rang. It was still dark out, but the air already buzzed with birdsong and the soft rustle of wind slipping through the old tin roof above the shop. She brewed coffee, wrapped up a few sandwiches, and left a small handwritten note on the counter. Closed today. Someone needs to see the one they still believe is home. They left Coldridge just after 6 a.m. Ruth's old pickup truck, which Chloe affectionately called the Winter Stallion, rattled up the hills, but today it ran strangely smooth, as if it understood it wasn't just carrying cargo, but a hope that had waited long enough to be named. Fort Landon was nearly 30 miles away, past winding back roads and dry pine forests. Ruth had driven past it a few times in her youth, always thinking of it like a memory she hadn't lived, quiet, overgrown, yet deeply real. The old checkpoint still stood, but the guard booth was empty. A handwritten sign hung loosely. Visitors, please do not cross the fence, Veterans Rest Area. Ruth parked the truck and looked at Mason. You sure? The boy nodded. I remember a house with a light green roof and an American flag out front. They followed a dirt trail still stained with red clay remnants of an old training ground. Each step felt slower, not from fear, but because facing memories often makes people hesitate. And then they saw it. A small house, no bigger than 2 rooms, faded roof tiles, a front garden with wilted tomato plants. A weathered American flag hung from the porch, a little sun-bleached but carefully folded at the corners. Mason walked ahead and knocked 3 times, just like in his memory. A sound stirred from inside. Then the door creaked open, and standing there was the man from the article, silver-haired, tanned back, still straight like he'd never truly left the service, and his eyes, stern yet quietly aching, the eyes of someone who'd survived war but never fully left the battlefield. Mason, he asked, almost like breathing the name. The boy nodded, unable to speak. General Granger stepped forward, dropped to one knee, and wrapped his arms around Mason, like someone embracing a letter they thought was lost, now suddenly returned. Ruth stood silently, not wanting to intrude, but then Granger looked up at her. You brought him, I did. He needed to come home. He nodded slowly. And you're the first person from Coldridge brave enough to do that. They didn't say much more, just sat on the porch sipping peppermint tea grown by the general himself. Mason sat between them, his eyes glowing not because he'd been rescued, but because someone had remembered him. Before they left, Ruth asked gently, "If he wants to stay, can you take guardianship?" Granger shrugged. They said, "I'm too old, too sick, not fit to raise a child. But if a boy like Mason still trusts me, maybe I'm living better than they think." Ruth smiled. He said, "You taught him how to spell friendship. Today, you just taught it back to me." The ride back to Coldridge was unusually quiet. Not the heavy kind of silence, but the kind that lingers when everything important has already been said through glances, a firm embrace, and a shared cup of tea beneath a weathered flag. Mason dozed off in the passenger seat, still holding the small badge in his hands like it might vanish again. Ruth drove her head tilted slightly toward the window eyes, following the rows of pine trees, as if asking if the journey is right. Does the starting point always welcome you back? She already knew the answer. As they pulled into town, Ruth stopped at the first traffic light on Main Street. An elderly woman pushing a grocery cart caught sight of Mason in the car and quickly turned away, pretending to search for loose change. Across the street, a group of teenagers on bikes paused when they saw the pickup. One of them nudged the other and sneered just loud enough for it to drift through the open window. "Hey, look, the kid's back. Bet the store had some National Honor Guard visitors." "Huh?" Ruth didn't respond, not because she wasn't angry, but because she knew rage doesn't build a path forward. It only makes people stand in place and shout louder. When they reached the shop, a new note had been taped over the signboard. Computer printed, clean font, no profanity, but somehow colder than graffiti. "We reserve the right to choose safe spaces for our children." The wording was tame, but the formatting, italicized, perfectly trimmed, made it crueler than any spray paint. Inside, Chloe was reading on the floor. She ran to greet her mom and Mason as soon as they walked in. Ruth embraced her daughter. Mason held up the badge proudly, eyes glowing. Chloe's eyes widened. "Wow, it's like a real-life power-up badge." "Yeah," Ruth laughed, "but instead of turning into a robot, it turns into Uncle Larry Coldridge's best tea brewer." All three of them laughed, but the laughter didn't erase the letter that had arrived in the mailbox that day. It was from the landlord, postmarked 3 days earlier. The message was brief. "Dear Ms. Callahan, due to multiple concerns raised by the community, we must terminate your lease at 18B Coldridge Main Street. Please vacate the premises by the 15th of this month. Sincerely." Ruth folded the letter without a word. Chloe looked up at her. "Are you okay, Mom?" "I'm okay, because I still have you. The store, we'll find another place. But if I lost you, then nowhere would feel like home." Mason lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Ruth turned to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, you don't need to apologize. If anyone should say sorry, they should start by knocking on the door." That night, Ruth sat alone behind the counter and hand-wrote a letter, not to anyone specific, but to herself. Some towns are too small to hold courage, and that's why sometimes it only takes one person standing tall to tip the scales. She folded the letter and tucked it into the old tin cookie box, the same one that once held hate mail. But this time she added a label, "Keep, to remember why you started." That night the temperature dropped suddenly. Winds swept down from the western mountains, slipping through the cracks in Coldridge's old wooden doors, rattling the closed sign on the front window like a gentle warning. Tomorrow won't be any easier. Ruth lit the oil stove behind the counter, a space that had become their living room, their bedroom, and their last fragile hope. Mason slept curled inside the sleeping bag, sent by General Granger, still clutching his badge. Chloe lay curled on the sofa, her worn wool blanket barely covering her tousled hair. Ruth couldn't sleep, not from the cold, but from a question that kept echoing in her mind. What exactly am I trying to hold on to, and for whom? Around midnight, Chloe stirred. "I know you're still awake, Mom," she whispered, eyes still closed. Ruth chuckled softly. "Well, you're not wrong." Chloe rolled to face her, her eyes shining like tiny lanterns in the soft glow of the stove. "Mom, we don't have to stay here, right, as long as we have each other." Ruth froze. An 8-year-old girl wrapped in her jacket because the heater sputtered had just said what most adults wouldn't dare admit. "I used to love this place," Ruth whispered. "The little shop, the regulars, the handwritten price tags. I thought if I stayed kind, stayed still, things would stay good." Chloe blinked slowly. "So, people hate us because we're kind." Ruth sat beside her and laid her head gently on her daughter's lap. "They hate us because they're afraid. Afraid that if they're not kind and still get by, then our kindness makes them feel small." A moment of silence. Then Chloe whispered as if singing her own lullaby, "Then don't be small, Mom. Stand tall. If we have to leave, let's leave proud, not with our heads down." Ruth turned away, hiding the sting in her eyes. That little girl, the one who used to ask, "Can we eat expired bread when rent was late?" was now the one keeping her mother from falling apart. The next morning, Ruth rewrote her request for assistance, the third one in 2 years. Mason taped a drawing on the fridge, 3 people standing outside a store with a red roof and a sign that read, "The Shelter, a place where everyone gets to stay." Chloe tied her hair back and put on her second-hand coat, proudly calling it vintage. Before stepping out the door, she turned to her mom, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "Mom, don't forget they can't take what we carry from home. We only lose what we leave behind." That morning, Ruth was brewing coffee when she heard it, a deep, heavy, deliberate sound coming from the front porch. It wasn't the usual sound of a car the townspeople had long stopped stopping by, and it wasn't footsteps. It was too uniform, too deliberate. She set the kettle down. Mason looked up from his notebook. Chloe peeked from the back room, still holding her toothbrush. When Ruth pulled back the curtain, her heart skipped a beat. Parked neatly outside the store as if part of a slow-motion military parade was a Humvee. The door swung open. A pair of polished black boots stepped out, followed by thick military trousers, a crisply buttoned jacket, and finally a familiar face, General Lawrence Granger. Mason bolted from the back barefoot, dashing across the wooden floor and bursting through the front door. "Uncle Larry." Granger bent down and caught him in a firm embrace, his eyes still bright, but this time carrying a steadier fire, as if something more resolute was burning beneath. Ruth stepped out behind them, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came here." For Granger looked at her, his mouth curling into a subtle, mischievous smile. "Because I'm done staying silent. Because I think it's time Coldridge remembered who really kept them safe." Within minutes, as if someone had rung a silent alarm across the town, people began to appear. From the second-floor window of the barber shop, the owner peeked through her curtains. A paperboy skidded to a stop, wide-eyed at the sight of the Humvee parked outside the store, once branded as a messy charity case. A middle-aged man in a postal uniform slowly approached, hesitant. "Sir, I served at Fort Landon, 2001. Do you remember Lieutenant Dean Lambert?" Granger nodded, clapping the man's shoulder. "Lambert was the finest sniper I ever had. And you are his son, and the guy who's been avoiding Miss Ruth for the past 3 weeks. I'm sorry." Ruth stood still, not out of surprise, but because moments like these, when truth steps forward without shouting or defense, are rare. A boy once turned away, a store once defaced, a woman armed only with kindness and hot coffee now standing beside a general in full daylight who said aloud what this town never dared to hear. She didn't just save Mason, she saved us. Because if this town forgets how to treat a child with decency, then we're no different than the battlefields I've seen. The crowd stood in silence, not because they didn't understand, but because deep down they knew he was right. If you've ever lived in a small town, you'd understand a handshake in a place like Coldridge isn't just social etiquette. It's a declaration, a moment forever stamped in the memory of a community. And that morning in front of a little grocery store, once spray-painted and threatened a single handshake, made the whole town fall silent. General Granger turned to Ruth. He didn't say a word. He simply extended his hand, steady, firm, and formal, as though he were signing a deployment order. Ruth hesitated, not out of doubt, but because it had been a long time since anyone had reached for her hand that way, especially after everything that had happened. Then she stepped forward and took it. In that fleeting moment, Coldridge exhaled. The first click was from a young reporter from the Coldridge Weekly. Moments later, the first video hit the town's social media page, captioned, "Ruth Callahan, the store owner, once boycotted, publicly commended by General Granger today." Shares rose faster than winter gas prices, and for the first time in weeks, comments no longer started with "that woman," but with "she." A silver-haired woman from the salon across the street stepped forward, Mrs. Glenda. She held a bundle of dried lavender, her voice trembling. "Miss Ruth, I'm sorry. I told my daughter she shouldn't play with Chloe. She came home yesterday crying, saying if her mom was afraid of kind people, how could she ever learn to be one herself?" Ruth accepted the bouquet. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She simply placed a hand gently on Glenda's arm. "Your daughter was the first person in town to speak the truth. You should be proud." And then something nobody expected. Mayor Samuel Price appeared. No one saw where he came from. He stepped out from behind the crowd, expression firm, suit impeccable, holding a hastily framed certificate that read, "Coldridge Community Award for Outstanding Civic Contribution." He approached Ruth, looked her in the eye, and said, "There are times when we fall short, but today this town would like to officially thank you for doing the right thing even when no one stood beside you." Ruth took the frame. Her hands shook slightly, not from pride, but because she'd grown used to wiping her own blood, keeping her own flame, and cleaning up the aftermath of others' silence. And now someone had finally said, "Thank you," out loud in front of everyone. Chloe whispered beside her mother, "That's the first time I've seen grown-ups say sorry properly." Ruth bent down and smiled. "Let's hope it won't be the last." The next morning, Ruth woke up later than usual, not because she was tired, but because for the first time in weeks, there was nothing pressing her to rush and open the store. But what surprised her wasn't that feeling of peace. It was what she saw through the window. A line. Yes, a long, winding line, like a group of school children waiting for free popsicles, stretching from Ruth's storefront all the way to the post office. Old folks, young parents, a few, pushing strollers, even the very men who once swore, "I'll never set foot in that place again." They stood there empty-handed, a bit sheepish, but their eyes, those were different now, not evasive, not cast downward, but the kind of look people wear when they realize they once shut their hearts and are now quietly asking if they can open them again. Ruth opened the door. The little bell above jingled for the first time in many days. The first to enter was Mr. Louis, the town's mailman, holding a bundle of old newspapers. "Miss Ruth, I saved a few issues of the Coldridge Weekly with the photo of you and General Granger. I figured maybe Chloe could use them someday for a school paper on unsung heroes." Ruth smiled softly. Let's hope she doesn't pick a fictional character. Next came Mrs. Glenda, not with flowers this time, but a vintage cookie tin. "My mother's old recipe. I thought you might need these in the days ahead if you plan on reopening." Ruth lifted the lid. Inside were heart-shaped butter cookies, some slightly burnt, others uneven. Just like the town itself, imperfect but well-meaning. And then the third person brought a lump to Ruth's throat. It was Principal Wallace, the very man who had once excluded her from a parent-teacher meeting due to delicate circumstances. He stepped in, removed his glasses, and spoke with a lowered voice. I owe you an apology, and I have a proposal. The school needs someone to run a reading club for students who are struggling. Chloe says you tell fairy tales beautifully, and I think someone who can warm up an entire town might know how to quiet a child's worries. Ruth looked around. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she asked, are all these people here because of General Granger, or because of me? A boy nearby, the same one who once teased Mason about being a transforming robot, stepped forward. He handed her a slip of paper and said, because we realized we acted like kids, but now we want to learn how to grow up. From you. The entire store fell silent. No one said a word. Only the rustle of paper bags, the scent of warm cocoa from the tiny kitchen, and a freshly written sign hung near the counter. You don't have to be perfect to walk in. You just have to be real. Some things need no paperwork to be confirmed, like family. And some days without ceremony or formal declarations still mark the moment someone truly belongs. Mason continued sleeping in the sleeping bag sent by Mr. Granger for several weeks, even though Ruth had already set up a small bed for him behind the freezer. When she suggested he move to the new bed, he simply said, I like sleeping close to someone's breathing. It makes it feel safer. And Ruth understood, because once she too could only sleep while listening to Chloe breathe, even if it was choppy and broken from nights of coughing. One afternoon, Chloe came home from school waving a slip of paper. Family Day is coming. Our teacher said we have to bring something that represents who we call home. Ruth smiled. So you're going to draw me? Chloe shook her head and replied as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. No, I'm drawing you Mason, and Uncle Larry too, but I'll need a special marker since he's far away. Ruth didn't say anything. She quietly stepped into the back room and pulled out the guardianship agreement. Mr. Granger had mailed clearly stating, I, Lawrence Granger, agree to temporarily transfer guardianship of Mason to Ruth Callahan during my recovery period. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Mason has already found the place he needs. I'm just the one signing off on that. A few days later, Ruth took Mason to the town's administrative office, holding a folder of documents, her heart thudding like the first knock but never gave. She filled out the forms, signed her name. When the clerk asked, what's your relationship to the child, she answered without hesitation, family, no temporary, no custodian, no caregiver, just one word, but enough to make Mason, standing beside her, lift his head slightly, his chest rising as if he were trying to steady something fragile but true. That evening, as Chloe wrote in her journal, she turned to Mason and asked, Hey Mason, if one day you get a real family, would you leave? He hesitated, then scratched his head. I think, if this isn't a real family, then what is? Chloe nodded. Yeah, I guess you're officially stuck being my big brother now. They both burst into laughter, and Ruth, behind the slightly ajar door, just sat quietly holding a mug of cold tea, smiling in silence. The following week, Mason started 6th grade at Coldridge Elementary. He signed up for track as his elective because he said, I want to learn how to run without running away. Chloe proudly introduced her new big brother to her classmates, and Mason wrote one simple line on his student profile, Family Ruth and Chloe Callahan. Status, no edits needed. Autumn in Coldridge always arrives quietly. It doesn't rush in like winter, nor does it bring the bustle of spring fairs. It simply appears one morning. Ruth stepped out in front of her store and noticed that the maple leaves had begun to turn amber, falling gently onto the doorstep, like a hello from someone long gone returning without fanfare. The little grocery store now had a new sign. No longer did it say Coldridge General in cold block letters. Instead, it was a hand-painted wooden sign in soft white strokes. The shelter, a place to stay. No frills, no bright colors, but every letter held sweat tears and a silence that had finally been heard. Mason now worked the counter on Saturday mornings. He nodded to each customer like a real shopkeeper, learned to use the register, and even picked up the habit of saving a cookie for the paperboy who always ran late. Chloe took charge of the visual marketing, meaning every sale flyer featured hand-drawn hearts, smiley faces, and occasionally a cat wearing a hat. And Ruth, she still stood behind the counter as she always had. Only now she no longer had to pretend to be strong. On a small shelf near the door stood a ceramic jar filled with free cocoa. Next to it, written in white chalk on a small board, "For the tired." For those who don't know, they're tired. And for anyone who just needs someone to believe they deserve to stay. Every night, Ruth was the one who turned off the lights last. Except one. The lantern hanging by the window facing the main road always stayed on a dim, steady light, like a tiny lighthouse, letting any wanderer know. You don't need to knock 3 times. You don't need a name. Just come in. One late evening, Chloe asked Mom, "What do you think made the town change?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, then softly replied, "Not General Granger. Not the news article. It was a boy who believed that if he knocked gently enough, but kept trying, someone would eventually hear. And if you're wondering whether this story is true, maybe not in Coldridge, but somewhere out there's a single mother pouring cocoa for someone she's never met. There's a child folding paper airplanes that say, "I'm not bad." And somewhere, a small porch light stays on just in case. If you've stayed with me this far, then maybe you too have once entered a room where no one thought you deserved to stay. Maybe you've been misunderstood, stood alone, unsure if you should open your door to someone. But you did. You still chose kindness. You still kept a light on while the world slept. So thank you. You are Ruth or Mason or Chloe in someone's story you don't even know is being written. And maybe someone out there is rewriting their life because of the quiet glow from a counter you once kept lit. Sleep well. And if tomorrow you start to doubt kindness again, remember this. So long as even one person believes in good, the dark won't stay long.